If you really like Shedeur Sanders and you were worried he wouldn't play for the Browns, worry no more. Andrew Berry spoke in the matter, and we'll speak on it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer Sherman, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. Andrew Berry set the record straight down at the Senior Bowl this week on several Shedeur Sanders narratives that are out there. Also, why it's already starting to feel like they'll end up taking a quarterback at number 2. And speaking of Andrew Berry, this offseason's kind of a back to the basics set situation for him. And he's got a lot to prove. We'll see if he is up to the task. I do want to thank you for being an everyday with the Locked On Browns podcast and for making us your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play just $5. Let's get after it. And as I said, Andrew Berry speaking down at the Senior Bowl this week. Some interesting comments to relay to a small gathering of media who were talking to him about Shedeur Sanders and really about a couple of the narratives that have been out there about Shedeur Sanders in relation to the Browns. The first one that I think is the most pressing of the two is this idea that he would not play for the Browns. And there's been plenty speculated, there's been plenty discussed about the idea that the Browns are not on a list of teams that Deion Sanders would be willing to let his son play for. We know Deion has been vocal about making sure his son ends up in a situation that's going to be advantageous to his career, is going to, put him in the best position to be successful at the next level. And he's not just going to let him go to whatever team. And the Browns are a franchise that has notoriously been essentially labeled as a quarterback graveyard, and rightfully so. When you have a mannequin in a window downtown storefront that has all the list of the quarterbacks that have played for this team since 1999, and Bailey Zappi at the end of the season was the 40th such player to start at that position for the Browns, you don't really have a lot of ground to stand on in terms of being a place that people consider a franchise that makes you successful or sets you up for success, or that players should be willing and wanting to go to. So they've kind of dug this grave, and it's up to them to sort of change those perspectives and narratives about themselves. But as far as Shedeur is concerned, it was interesting that Andrew Berry made it sound like it's not something that is an issue. He basically made it seem like it was a non-issue altogether. And that is important for the context of where this team is at, what they're trying to do. As they're trying to address this position. Andrew Berry's exact words were, "I don't anticipate that being a problem," when he was asked about the idea that Shedeur or Deion Sanders would nix him potentially coming to Cleveland. And so it seems like they have already had those types of discussions. We know that the Browns did meet with Shedeur Sanders in Texas at the Shrine Bowl, where he is participating throughout this past week and leading into the game, which is on Thursday. He's not going to play in the game, and he was not practicing, but he was doing interviews and all those types of things. And so Berry clearly got some sort of indication in those conversations that he doesn't think that that's going to be a problem. That's a good sign, obviously, for a number of reasons. You now know, like, if you were to take Shedeur Sanders at number 2, they're not going to make a stink about it. They're not going to cause some scenes. So that's I guess the good news, at least as things stand right now. Obviously, this could change as things get closer. Maybe Deion does get more vocal about things. Maybe he does say something to the organization. Who knows? But as things stand right now, Andrew Berry has basically no worries about it. And so, yeah, if that's the player they hone in on, if that's the player that they want, they, again, in January, feel comfortable that if they pull the trigger, they that he would show up and be the player that they're hoping that he could be. Now, the flip side of this could be that the flip side of this could obviously be that maybe they just don't think they're going to take a quarterback, and so they're basically saying, like, yeah, it shouldn't be a problem because we're not going to even take that player. We're going to probably trade back, whatever. Like, they already have a sense of maybe what they want to do, or what direction they might go, or that they value other players more. Maybe that's what he means by that. But I think it more so it was more so the former, where he's saying, listen, that's not a concern on our end. We don't think that's going to be a problem. And that leads me to believe that they've had those conversations and that they're at least on a place right now of a level play, a level field, I guess is one way to put it, with Shedeur and his camp and his dad, that like if he comes here, he would play. So yes, in this quest for a quarterback, that's the best news that the Browns could receive. And I also think it means that maybe the narrative that the Browns are this terrible place is overblown, or at least that Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski have done enough over the last several years, even after a 3-14 season, to prove to people that this is an organization that is going to put you in a position to be successful, and that isn't something necessarily that people need to be up in arms worried about all the time when it comes to the Browns. So, that's maybe more of a bigger picture thought, that they've turned the culture around enough that people are bought in. I think we saw some of that with the way guys came back, flocked back to the team last offseason because they felt like there was unfinished business there. And not to say Cleveland is a destination necessarily across the league, but it does seem like they've worked to change some of those perspectives and narratives about this franchise over the last 5 years. So that's the good news for the Browns, on top of the fact that now it sounds like there's no worries about potentially drafting him. And then the other narrative that he basically addressed was this report that came out last week about how Shedeur Sanders decided not to participate in the Shrine Bowl practices and game because he was advised by the three teams picking at the top of the draft, the Titans, the Browns, and the Giants, not to. And so I think at the time that report was pretty interesting, because it almost felt like, they were telling him like, hey, don't even put yourself out there to get injured. But Andrew Berry said like that was not they had no indication, or they had no involvement in telling him not to play. That wasn't something that they did. They said they're not holding that against him, that he's not playing. Like, it's not something that's going to be a factor for them. But he made it very clear that was not something that they discussed at that juncture. So I thought that was interesting too, because again, that would sort of suggest that there's certainly some interest there if they were like, hey, let's protect this player. Not that I don't think there's interest anyway, but Berry was kind of doing some he was basically trying to right the ship on some of those comments and some of those reports that are out there, make it known that, there's not some of the red flags or some of the things that people have brought up about him and tried to use as a reason not to draft Shedeur Sanders weren't really problems that they are, putting the red flag up for, or that they are focusing on as they go through this evaluation process with Shedeur and with all these quarterbacks. So I think that's important to know, and some important context from Andrew Berry down at the Senior Bowl. I talked about it yesterday. Kevin Stefanski is present at the Senior Bowl. He's been showing up at these offseason events this year, and I think there's an obvious reason why. I'll tell you, more and more this thing plays out already. I know it's only January. It does feel like the Browns are truly pursuing one position. You know which one I'm talking about. I will elaborate on this some more when we get back, coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. It's easy how it works. You just pick more or less on at least two players' projections, and if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for the big game, where one of the starting quarterbacks just has to throw for 1 yard. Yes, you heard that right, 1 yard. You can pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. Leading up to the big game, I'm already looking at Travis Kelce having more receiving yards than whatever his total is going to be on the app, after having a less impactful game against the Bills. Don't forget also to take advantage of their promos tab, where you can tail any of the super sweet Millie winners, big game lineups. If you tail a lineup that goes 3 for 3, you can win a split of $1 million in promo funds. Download the app, use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. It's all at PrizePicks. Run your game. So it's interesting. I talked yesterday about Kevin Stefanski's presence at the Senior Bowl and how he's making an effort to be at these events and what that kind of means. And I do think on some level, not even on some level, I think the bottom line is he's making a more concerted effort to be involved in these things and in this process because they are finally letting him pick his quarterback. It's not Baker Mayfield, who was already here when you got here. It's not go trade for Deshaun Watson because you're trying to swing big and get that franchise guy. It's let Kevin find the guy that's going to work best for his offense and finally pair him with somebody that he can work with on a regular basis that makes this thing go successfully and can, be the well-oiled machine that we feel it can be when we hired Kevin Stefanski in the first place. That's, to me, what all this indicates. And so knowing that he's there, knowing that his presence is felt at some of these offseason events, maybe more so than it's been in the past, I can't help but feel like, and again, it's January 29th. It's early. There's still a lot of time and a lot of things are going to play out. But I can't help but feel like they are solely focused on the quarterback position at 2, knowing that and understanding that. Now, again, maybe they're just trying to get a lay of the land because, Kevin Stefanski is ultimately going to, if he finds somebody in the later rounds that he really likes, which, by the way, Jalen Milroe had a bad day to go on the first day of practices to go along with his smaller hands, the measurements of his smaller hands that came out over the weekend. Maybe he finds a guy he likes later. And so that's the decision that they make is they're not going to take 1 or 2, but it feels like they are pushing the chips into the center of the table to find and identify that guy at number 2. And on some level, again, maybe I disagree with that. I've kind of said all along, trading back feels like the thing that makes the most sense to me, but on some level, I understand where they're looking around and saying, hey, we might not be here next year. And as much as I can sell people or bring up the idea of trade back, get an accumulation of picks, trade up next year, sometimes that is easier said than done, especially if you're in the 20s and you're trying to get up into the top 10. That's not an easy jump to make, even if you do have a stockpile of picks. And so I can understand where they're looking around saying, look, we're here. We didn't want to be here, but we're here. We need to figure out which quarterback is going to work for us best, and we need to try to take that guy because we need to get this position right collectively, and it needs to be something where we can sell it to everybody moving forward. Like, we got a guy for the future. We feel really good about him, and we know he works with the system and the offense that we're trying to run. I don't, again, I've said all along, I don't want to see this front office and this organization panic and just pick a quarterback to pick a quarterback. So I trust that they are going through that process and trying to figure out what traits they're looking for, who fits that best, who's going to fit Kevin Stefanski's offense best, obviously being a primer and an important piece of that as well. But again, it doesn't have to be that they're panicking just because they pick a quarterback. I do want to make that clear. If they identify the right guy at 2, then yeah, take the right guy at number 2. But again, Stefanski's presence at these things definitely feels like we are all in on identifying this position specifically this offseason right now when we know we're picking number 2 overall. And I can understand that from a standpoint of you're controlling what you can control on some level, right? You have the number 2 pick right now. You don't know what the future is going to hold. It is, as much as I love the idea of trading back, collecting picks, like I said, and then trying to trade them next year, there's a lot of unknowns that come with that. Is next year's quarterback class going to be worlds better? I know Arch Manning's talked about as the guy next year that everyone wants, but is he going to come out? Would he stay in college next year? I wouldn't necessarily bank on that, but if he does, then yeah, maybe then you don't have as many great quarterbacks as you thought in next year's class. Is there somebody that you feel like you're definitely going to like in next? There's so many variables. Yeah, it's also about where you end up in the draft, how next season goes. And as I've said before, this organization has to be building towards, we got to make it back to the playoffs to save our jobs, get everybody sort of calm again, and feeling like this is the right regime to lead this team moving forward. So there's just a lot in play here. And so you're controlling what you can control. You're at number 2 right now. You have a chance to draft one of these quarterbacks, and somebody will draft one of these quarterbacks. And it's just about making sure that you get it right. And I understand why there's a lot of trust, maybe questions about trusting Barry to be the guy making that call, trusting whether or not these guys can evaluate and identify the right quarterback for that for this team, for this job, for this role. Those are all valid concerns. But if that's what they're honing in on, that's what they're honing in on. And it certainly feels that way just kind of reading the tea leaves. I also thought, as we talked about in the first segment, like Barry's answers to the questions about Shedeur Sanders, I think are pretty telling too. Like they're clearly going into this thing head on, and having the tough conversations with somebody like Shedeur about would you play for us, and making sure like they dot all their I's and cross all their T's on who's going to be the best fit and what they bring to the table. And that's how the process should be going. So again, as I've made my stance clear, I think trading back makes the most sense. I don't feel good about these quarterbacks in general in this class. And the scouts have kind of told you some of the same things. Anything that's come out about this class, it's been that it's not that good. It's relatable to 2022, which was a bad quarterback class as well. And so I have my doubts. I have my concerns. But I also understand where if you're the Browns, you need this position and you do need to get it right. And, at some point, you can't just keep like kicking the can down the road the way Barry maybe does with some of these contracts and hope that somebody falls in your lap. You got to sort of, and I'll say this, like, it took a lot of risk to make the Deshaun trade in the first place, but that was a move that was like trying to control your own destiny, if you will. Like, well, hey, we're not going to let fate decide who our next quarterback is. We're going to go get our next quarterback. Let's make the big splash. And I've never faulted the organization for trying to go get that franchise guy and make that move. It's just about who they brought in that obviously was the problem and obviously didn't work out and backfired royally in their face. So I've said too, like they are going to have to take some risks to get this ship back, get this ship afloat, get things back on track and to find that quarterback. So if that risk becomes you're at number 2 and you're going to take a guy in a class that's, kind of projected to be a down class, then I guess that's the risk that you got to take. I can't blame them for trying to do that. I just have my doubts about this class, but they're the experts here. They're even better evaluators than I'll ever be. They've forgotten more football than I'll ever even learn. So they're going to go through their process, but sitting here today in late January, it does feel like this is setting up for the Browns to take a quarterback. And I'm just, again, reading the tea leaves here, but Kevin Stefanski's presence is not something that I take lightly in that way. It speaks to me that this is a true evaluation of those gunslingers, those signal callers going on, and that they are bound and determined to identify the one that's going to work best for them so that they can have a quarterback they feel good about moving forward into the future, and to sell obviously to the fan base moving forward and the team moving forward that they're serious about contending quickly and not stripping this thing all down and starting all over. Speaking of Andrew Berry and the decisions he has to make this offseason, I saw some interesting comments on, his background, where he came from the Eagles organization. And it kind of got me thinking, this has to be a get back to the basics type offseason for Andrew Berry after some of his misses in recent years. We'll talk about it more coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes are waiting and wondering and worrying if you are going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching you with a TurboTax expert who can get your taxes done as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while they get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. That is Taxes. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service, real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. So I saw an interesting tweet from Dan Orlovsky of ESPN on Tuesday night, where he was saying, he was talking and ranting and raving about Howie Roseman's last several drafts with the Eagles. And he said the last 4 drafts could go down as one of the better 4-year draft stretches in a long time. Absolutely destroyed the first 3 rounds of each draft. If I was the team looking for a GM, I would poach from the Eagles front office. And so I think Dan Orlovsky's right. The Eagles have been a model organization in terms of drafting and identifying talent. Howie Roseman is one of the best in the business at that. And he has built a juggernaut of a team that is now ready to play for a Super Bowl in just, a little under a week and a half from now. So like his resume, his draft prowess speaks for itself. He's been phenomenal. And that Eagles organization is phenomenal. But I was quickly reminded, not like by somebody, but like it quickly hit me again. Like that's what the Browns did. The Browns tried to tap into this brilliance that is Howie Roseman in the Philadelphia Eagles organization by hiring Andrew Berry, who spent the 2019 season with the Eagles as an assistant GM, and then comes to Cleveland, and they're thinking like, we're going to be able to replicate this. And it's gone the complete polar opposite of how anybody thought it would. I think people did like this move at the beginning because of how respected and regarded Howie Roseman is, but it hasn't come to fruition the way that the Browns thought, the way that I think Browns fans thought, the way any of us thought. And, when you talk about hitting on guys in the draft, like Andrew Berry's hits are harder to find than, Dan Orlovsky's talking about like Howie Roseman crushed in the first 3 rounds of the last 4 drafts. And I understand the Browns didn't have first round picks 3 of the last 4 years. So that makes it a little bit tougher, but it's not like you are looking at this roster and feeling like the guys that they have, they've drafted in the second rounds, drafted in the 3rd rounds, are like blowing teams away either. I mean, Mike Hall Jr. this year, I think he showed some promise. Still some unknowns about him, and he's gotten injured. Zach Zinter from this past class didn't get a ton of reps. Still looks like he's kind of raw for being a guard at the next level. He's got some things to figure out. Cedric Tillman, a 3rd rounder from 2023, guy who seemed like he seems like of the last couple drafts, he seems like the one that I shouldn't say that because Martin Emerson was in 2022 and he seems like he's got some potential as a 3rd rounder as well. But Cedric Tillman is one of the guys who's like, okay, this guy could be something. So you got one. Siaki Iko was a 3rd rounder in 2023 though as well. He's not even on the roster anymore. Martin Emerson, like I said, showed some promise, took a step back this year, but I think he could still be a good player. Alex Wright was a 3rd rounder. He's got some promise. But again, like all the guys are talking about, it's like they have promise. They have promise. None of them are contributing, it feels like, the way that the Eagles draftees are contributing. I mean, they like took the entire Georgia defense in the last like 3 years or so and just put it into the NFL, and they've been brilliant. The one draft that Barry does deserve credit for is 2021, where Greg Newsome, I don't know that he's lived up to being a 1st-round pick, but he's been good. And he is still on the roster and contributing at a high level as their nickel corner. And then Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah has been brilliant, but now they might not have him depending on what his career outlook becomes after this neck injury. Anthony Schwartz is the 3rd rounder from that class that obviously didn't really pan out. So, I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I'm not expecting the GM to hit on every pick, but the roster, the roster development and the identifying talent and drafting it and developing it at the next level, that has been a problem for this team. And that starts on Andrew Berry's desk. Like, he is the person responsible for filling out this roster and being able to supplement years in ahead for like, okay, we got guys coming up who can fill voids at these potential positions in the future. And we just haven't seen the results of that yet from Andrew Berry in the way that this roster has been assembled. So this offseason for him truly is about getting back to the basics. And what I mean by that, well, I mean, there's a couple things, but the biggest thing I mean by that is like when you're a GM or when you're aspiring to be that, you start, as somebody who's just like breaking down tape, a quality control coach, like that type of stuff, or you're just like breaking down tape, doing the grunt work and working your way up. And then you're a scout, and then you're this, then you're that, and you work your way up to being a GM. And so like this year, he has to just get back to being a scout. He has to get back to identifying the right players, identifying the talents that are going to be useful to this Browns team, useful to this Browns roster, that are going to be future pieces that help you achieve the things that you're trying to achieve, and build out the roster through the draft. Get back to doing it that way rather than having to like go swing big on free agents or whatever and make it happen through free agency. Because the best teams are built through the draft. We know that. We see that. I mean, the Browns tried to cut the line with drafting a quarterback or with finding a franchise quarterback. It didn't work. The teams that we're talking about playing in the Super Bowl, the teams that we're talking about playing deep into the playoffs, all those teams drafted to develop their own quarterbacks. Like, the draft is so important in terms of a talent acquisition standpoint and how you build a roster. And that's what you get into being a GM for. Like, you get into it because you enjoy that part of the process, the scouting, the breaking it down, the finding and identifying future stars at the next level. So Barry has to get back to that. He has to, and if he does that and he can hit on some guys this year, it may just save his job. He may find his quarterback, meanwhile, as we talked about last segment, and it may put him in a position to be here in Cleveland for years to come alongside Kevin Stefanski. Like, there's a lot at stake for him. He can't operate from a point of panic, though, and I don't know that he will. But, man, like, this year is so important for the Browns, and it's really important for Andrew Berry, even more so than it is for Kevin Stefanski, because Kevin Stefanski could take whatever roster he gets next year, squeeze as much out of it as possible, and he could keep his job. And I think Andrew Berry would be the one you're pointing the finger at, saying, like, this roster, like, you didn't have first-round picks a bunch of years, but, like, you just haven't found the talent. So it is pivotal that he gets back to the basics this year, identifies the right players for the Browns, identifies good players for the Browns, especially in those first couple rounds, the day ones and day twos, and that they get this thing back on track through the ways that they through the players that they draft, and bring guys in that can truly be developed into future contributors on the Cleveland Browns. I think he's working towards that. You know, he took the blame for the way this roster was compiled this past year when you go 3-14, but we got to see it to believe it. And Andrew Berry definitely has a lot to prove, especially coming from an Eagles organization, as Dan Orlovsky pointed out, that certainly has a lot of prowess when it comes to the way that Howie Roseman runs things, and has been able to just build a juggernaut of a roster that, again, is playing for their second Super Bowl in 3 years. It's been brilliant. And I hope some of that has rubbed off on Andrew Berry to the point where he can get this thing going in the right direction this offseason for you and, of course, for all Browns fans. Another episode down with you, Dog Pound. Thank you for joining me, as always, to talk about your favorite football team, even after a disappointing season. But the offseason is in full swing, as we know, and I hope you continue to make us your first listen each and every single day. For your second listen, go find a new Locked On NFL show, or if you want to keep it local, you can check out Locked On Cavs or Locked On Guardians. Thanks for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you again real soon, Cleveland.